Emoji Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Section 2 of the Breaking of the Day, which is going to be about the Odyssey by Homer. We've already discussed the Iliad, and this is going to be very much indebted to the work of Auerbach in Momentus, which is a very important book of literary criticism that I highly suggest. And you know, I think sometimes there's a temptation, especially in philosophical schools, not to really take literature seriously or to read literary criticism, but if religion shapes society, the last section we argued that if you believe the gods don't control fate, if you believe the gods do control fate, if you believe the gods love mankind, if you believe the gods are messing with mankind like playthings, then that is going to impact how society is shaped. You know, we learn from Auerbach the argument that God is formed in the image of our Father. So, for example, if we say God is the Father, then our idea of God is a projection of what we think an ideal Father is onto God. But the argument made in that paper, inspired by Bart, is the idea that it works the other way as well. That even if it is the case that our perception of the God is shaped by our society, well, then our perception of the gods shapes our society. It works both ways. It's not just a one-way street. Well, in the same way that the stories that we tell are often a reflection of the societies we live in, that stories don't take the forms they do for arbitrary reasons. So if stories in our society are X way, then that says something about us, that our society is in somehow X way, which is probably X way because of our religion. And so stories, religion, and society all kind of feed each other, because the stories we tell ourselves tend to reinforce certain ideas, and then our stories form our society. So our societies are formed by our ideas of the gods, which are then reinforced by our stories, but then our stories give us ideas of what the gods are like, which may transform our view of the gods, which then changes our society, and it all shapes one another. And literary criticism can give us an overview of how societies form and why they think the way they do. So it has an important role, and I think we see that in Momentus. Peter Kreeft would always talk about that Japanese emperor who would disguise himself as a peasant and go between the towns, and he would listen to the music. And if the music was peaceful or serene, he would move on to the next village. But if he arrived and the music was heavy and chaotic and so forth, then he would send in the army. He would send in the army to stabilize the area, because the idea is that the kind of music people listen to says something about the society they are in. Likewise, the kind of stories we tell ourselves probably says something about the kind of people we are. So we really need to pay attention to the stories we tell. The subject material, the style, the form, the character development, all of these things say something about us. Our stories tend to be mirrors. And with the idea in mind that society is reflected in our stories, it's very interesting to look at the Odyssey. And the beginning of Momentus by Auerbach compares the Old Testament with Homer, and he makes this point that there is he references Schiller, who says that Homer retarded suspense. There's really no suspense in Homer, because everything is expressed. Every detail is put into the mouth of characters. What Auerbach says is, in Homer, nothing is half in darkness or unexternalized. All inner thoughts, emotions, backstory, motive are voiced and explained. There are no unplumbed depths, even at the expense of narrative tension. But what's interesting is, as we'll get into, in the Bible, however, we see a shift to internalization, uncertainty, and mystery. And this really stands in very strong contrast to Homer. In the Bible, everything remains unexpressed. So there's a style to the Odyssey where everything is in the open. There is no internal life that has to be wrestled with, that has to be suffered, that has to be lived with. And that's kind of the exact opposite of what we find ourselves in today under pluralism, where givens have been destroyed. You know, what does Ulysses do when he comes home and he finds that the suitors have taken over his land? Well, he fights them and kills them all. It's just violence. You know, if he comes to a land that is occupied by foreign aliens, if you will, well, then the honorable thing, following classical virtue, is to expel them, to kill them, to get rid of them. But that's not what we can do, is it? You know, if we come home to America, we might be tempted to do it, but then, of course, that's totalitarianism. You know, if we're in America and we feel like America isn't great again, Well, we can't just go out and kill all the liberals we blame for changing America. We have to instead learn to live with that tension in an internalized and subjective world. We have to learn to live with it. We have to be a Ulysses, if you will, who comes home and stays disguised as a beggar, who lives in that disguise and lives with the suitor. He doesn't get rid of them, which of course would then suggest that the classical virtues of an Achilles will not do for us under pluralism, which would then suggest, of course, that we have moved from Homer to the Bible. We've moved from Athens to Jerusalem in our societies. Now, maybe Nietzsche wouldn't like that. For Nietzsche, I guess a Christian Ulysses, which is kind of maybe what we're forced to be, in the sense that we're Ulysses, we've returned home and it's been taken over by suitors, maybe, or that's how we feel. And do keep in mind, although I make the example of Trump voting conservatives feeling like they're surrounded by suitors, it of course works the other way. Liberals feel like they're surrounded by crazy conservatives, and thus they are a Ulysses who's forced to live with the suitors, if you will. This is not a one-way street. It works every way. Everyone feels this way. Everyone feels like they're surrounded by aliens, if you will. Not necessarily violent suitors or people who are trying to take their home, but they feel like they are surrounded by people different from them, and it's not an option to kill them all. Unfortunately, the temptation of totalitarianism, or the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt describes, is a giving in to the temptation to return to classical virtues, or at least the creating of the conditions that bring back the classical givens. And that's how I guess you could combine Leo Strauss's German nihilism with this demand for higher life, and then it falls into a new everydayness, a new banality of evil in accordance with that revolution of German nihilism to return to higher, quote-unquote, honorable virtues, which paradoxically can be a source of great terror. Anyway, this is all to say that we seem to be today a kind of Christian Ulysses. We all feel that way. And that would fall in line with the form of the Bible. So we're not in a society where we feel inside a rage toward the Trump voters, we feel inside a rage toward the liberals. We have to leave that unexpressed. If we express it, well, then the society can fall apart. And arguably, what could be happening today is that too many people are expressing their discontent with people that disagree with them, and thus we have all the tribalism and political turmoil and stuff like that. But moving where in Homer, subjectivity is combated with expression. In the Bible, subjectivity is inescapable. Auerbach makes this point really well, where he says, in the Bible, God just kind of appears, and he's speaking to Abraham. He just calls out Abraham. There's no explanation of the journey he went on to get there. He just says, and the text is very sparse, right? Abraham takes his son up the mountain, and that's basically all it says. It doesn't tell you what Abraham is thinking. It doesn't tell you what Isaac is thinking. It doesn't tell you what they're thinking. Very little is expressed. So there's a deep internal life that is suggested by the Bible, and there's a massive psychological depth. So you have a movement there in the literature from the external and less psychological to the internal and more psychological, which, if we agree with Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, and obviously we're talking about Judaism here, but it's going to carry over into Christianity, this emphasis on the inner life, because what is Jesus always commanding? You commit adultery when you lust after another woman. There's all these sins of the heart. It's not simply enough not to do certain things. You also have to control your internal life. So if we follow Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, that there's a radical weakness here, a slave mentality, then it's almost as if the slave morality is the life of the person who is always internalized. The internalized life is an enslaved life, and yet that is also a life that arguably is more peaceful, and that has less violent, and that if you don't give in to that quote-unquote slave morality, you could be tempted by a German nihilism to restore heroic virtue, but that could break through into the radical violence that we see of Ulysses at the end. Maybe not, and I don't want to commit the mistake of associating Nietzsche with Nazism, because I think that's a mistake. But it's certainly a possibility. So what are we to do today under pluralism? Are we to be a Christian Ulysses, or are we to fight back? Well, fighting back would be a problem. Another, I think, famous character who attempts to be like Ulysses is a Don Quixote, but who in a Christian and yet demystified world is frankly insane. When he returns home, Quixote returns home, he realizes not only that he was disillusional, but that he was also just he was living according to ethics that were never even there. So it's almost like he didn't even go on a journey. There's this paper we did called The Age of Hysteria, which has this idea that in a demystified world, the masculine, to use Freudian archetypes or Jungian archetypes, goes on a journey. But then when they arrive at the truth, represented by the feminine, they realize that the ethics and values by which they went on the journey are ultimately arbitrary. So it's as if the journey was not even a journey at all. It's like it vanishes all at once. And I think this is represented and that's a hysterical truth. It causes hysteria to accept that truth. And I think this is somewhat represented when Don Quixote returns home, realizes he was crazy or wrong, and turns back into Alanosia the good and dies. He turns back into who he really was and dies. It's quite tragic, and it kind of captures that whole Freudian hero's quest, if you will, at least in my mind. And that's kind of what we find ourselves in. Ulysses, killing all the suitors is not an option, nor should it be an option. I think that if the ethics against Ulysses are in fact Christian, then that Christian evolution is a positive evolution. It's a moral evolution. It's good. But it does mean that we have to learn to live with the suitors. We have to live in their mess, which is existentially exhausting and going to result in us having a deeper and more difficult subjective life. And this might start to suggest why mental health is becoming more of an issue today. Freud and Jung and all of them understood that as nations developed, became more first world than second or third world, then psychological problems became more of an issue because you became more focused on the inner life. But it also would seem to be the sake that as pluralism increases, which I guess goes together with becoming a first world nation, that we also find ourselves having to deal with a deeper subjective life. And that, I think, is represented, that movement, in the movement from Homer's Odyssey to the Bible. So today we have to be a Christian Ulysses. Anyway, this has been section 2 of The Breaking of the Day with a focus on the Odyssey. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.